Today we're going to talk about the development of political parties in the United States. My name is Tom Keefe. I'm an assistant professor of humanities at Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. And down here, since we're talking about political parties, if you've ever been to DC in Union Station, they always have cardboard cutouts of the current president and first lady, so you can always go down and get your picture there with them. So political parties. At the time of the founders, they called parties factions. In Britain, they had a binary system similar to what we have today. They were called the Whigs and the Tories. And our founding fathers intentionally left out political parties from the government. They considered it to be a negative restraint on democracy, and they were trying to do something new, and they were trying to get rid of what they considered to be one of the sins of Europe. Interestingly enough, the president of the Constitutional Convention was George Washington, our first president. And again, he did not think political parties were a good idea. In fact, they tried so hard to get rid of political parties that, from today's perspective, is kind of funny. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3 originally said that whoever came in second in the presidential election would become the vice president. That only actually wound up being an issue once. I guess technically it happened 3 times. But Washington and Adams got along fine. In the third U.S. election, though, it was a pretty contentious election between Adams and Jefferson. Adams wins the election, and his vice president is the guy he just defeated, Thomas Jefferson. Could you imagine if Donald Trump's vice president was Hillary Clinton? So Washington, in fact, wrote this and presented this in his farewell speech. He really, really did not like political parties and factions. He predicted, and I think eloquently, that political parties would turn to the purposes of their own elevation, and the leaders of parties would be more interested in their own elevation, and it would be the duty of all wise people to discourage and restrain factions. And that, interestingly enough, whether it be Clinton Gore with the Chinese Buddhist temple money that came in, or the 2016 election with the Russian money and bots coming in, that again, Washington, the genius of Washington, predicted that foreign influence and corruption could happen. Unfortunately, we developed political parties anyways. We've had about 4 or 5, depending on how you count them. The first alignment was Federalist versus what were called Anti-Federalists, but from a political perspective or a marketing perspective, you don't want to be anti-something. So they eventually, they were called the Anti-Federalists, they were called Jeffersonians, they eventually settled on the term Democratic Republicans. And on the opposite side of that were the Federalists or the Hamiltonians. They were very successful in the first, 3 presidential terms. But since their main issue was the creation of a federal government, once we've created a federal government, they kind of ran out of issues. There were some other issues, whether it be Francophile or Anglophile, and yeoman republic versus business, and those issues that do continue to develop later in our country's history. But essentially, this first alignment lasted really just during the time of Washington, Adams, and Jefferson's tenures. By the time you get this guy underneath the term Democratic Republicans, that is President James Monroe, by the time you get to Monroe, the Federalists have disappeared. In fact, that's why this period is called the era of good feelings. Everybody belonged to the same political party. However, the contentious issue was the role and the size of government. Westerners in particular thought it was really important that the federal government help develop the West, putting in canals and putting in roads. Whereas, people on the North, for example, they didn't really see how that was the government's business. They had roads, they already had canals, they didn't really need it. And so you have the beginnings of this development, this question that we still debate today: how big should the government be? And what should the government be doing? The second alignment occurs basically around what's called the Age of Jackson. The Democratic Republicans had basically fragmented on this issue of national role the role of the national government in the development of the country. The Whigs took a very nationalistic perspective, and Jackson took a very populist perspective, but he was an insider, anti-Washington, and so he ran for office as an outsider and a states' rights person. Interestingly enough, and this is a very common pattern in American history, once he became the president, he did start to favor some nationalist issues. For example, he took a really hard line against the nullification crisis. In other aspects, he did maintain his states' rights issues. Unfortunately and famously, he said John Marshall has rendered his decision, now let him enforce it, and that was his way of washing his hands of the Cherokee versus Georgia cases, and allowing and ultimately facilitating Georgia removing the Native Americans. So this is why I kind of hesitated there for a second, because yes, we're talking about political parties, but then there's this issue of populism within both political parties. There has always been this undercurrent of the establishment versus populism. Populism is roughly defined as support for the concerns of the ordinary people. Generally speaking, the establishment people in both parties consider populists to be pandering. And generally speaking, populists within both parties consider the establishment to be out of touch. So in the Republican Party, Teddy Roosevelt, Donald Trump are examples of populist movements. And in the Democratic Party, Andrew Jackson and Bernie Sanders would be examples of the populist movements. Hooray, I'm popular. The third alignment develops as the Whigs collapse. And this new party made up of Whigs and former Whigs, former Know-Nothings, former American Party members, they develop around this idea of abolitionism, essentially. So they're the first leader of the Republican Party, or the first person nominated in 1856 to run for president as a Republican is John C. Fremont. Obviously, Lincoln is the first elected Republican, and then on the right there we have Stephen Douglas and Samuel Tilden as the leaders of the Democratic Party as it emerges in and out of the Civil War period. In this particular alignment, the Republican Party is a very federal party, and the Democratic Party is the states' rights party, which is interesting because we think about that different today. But again, this reoccurring issue, what is the role of the federal government, and what should the balance of power be between the federal government and the states? Both parties, or both ideologies, because the terms of the parties change, they have grounds in the Constitution, right? So the reservation clause, that the idea that powers not granted to the federal government are reserved for the states. On the other hand, the very expansive clause, the Commerce Clause, in the Elastic Clause, that Congress can pass any law that's necessary for it to do its other duties. So the genius and the unfortunate problem in the Constitution is there are grounds for both ideological perspectives. What happens in this fourth alignment, and this is kind of where we still are today, but we'll talk about that in a second, is in many ways the two parties flipped platforms. That the Republican Party, which had been a federal party and had been interventionalist, right, because they wanted to stop slavery and they wanted to tell the southern states what to do, they had become known more as the laissez-faire party. The Democratic Party, on the other hand, which had been a southern-based regional states' rights party primarily, and that's obvious exceptions with Stephen Douglas being like the northern token, and then later the reason that Tilden was important is because again he was a northerner. The idea of pulling out somebody from your enemy's strength to run against him. But anyways, I digress. The Democrats, under the leadership of Franklin Roosevelt, became a much more inclusive, proactive, large government political party. And so, yes, the Republicans in the Third alignment were Federalists and the Democrats were states' rights. And then now in the fourth alignment, the Republicans become more states' rights and laissez-faire, and the Democrats become more federal and interventionist. Still debating the size of government or the role of government, and then more particularly as it, starting in the late 1800s and all the way through today, as the economy becomes much more complicated, what is the role of government in relation to the economy? It's an important issue. So the people on the left, we'll talk about that term in a moment too, generally speaking, believe in a big government. They believe the government has a responsibility to provide a lot of services and programs, and therefore in order to pay for it, you're going to have higher taxes. People on the right generally believe it's not the role of government to take care of these large social programs and so forth. And so therefore, if there's no need to have large government, then there's no reason to have a large amount of taxes. So this is what I meant about left and right. Starting around this time period, the 40s and 50s, we start to use the terms left and right more in American political history. And the terms left and right come out of the French Revolution, where the Jacobins were the left-wingers, and that's where they sat. They sat on the left side from the center, from the speaker's chair. They sat to the speaker's left, and the Girondists and the monarchists sat on the right side. So, left and right. Another interesting and important issue that is debated about the role of government in the post-World War II period is what is the role of government in the area of civil rights and civil liberties. So you have Truman desegregating the armed forces, you have the beginnings of the civil rights movement. Should the government facilitate the development of civil rights, or should the government keep their hands off and wait for society to figure it out on its own? Here we have, again, as I just mentioned, Truman desegregating the army. That's an action of the federal government, but it's a limited action, right? Because it's the president in his capacity as the commander of the armed forces. It was not an expansive desegregation, though that later comes out of the courts. Interestingly enough, a Republican president, Dwight David Eisenhower, is the first to use more expansive executive authority in order to promote and enforce desegregation. So in 1896, there was the famous case Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, and then in 1954, Brown versus Topeka says no, there is no such thing, and that's what Eisenhower was enforcing, specifically the Little Rock incident. And so coming out of all of this, civil liberties, civil rights, and the size of government, the role of government, you have this development where people on the right tend to believe that it's the government's role to make sure that corporations have equal protection under the law, right? Coming out of the Dartmouth case 200 years ago, the idea that a corporation is a non-living person and therefore has the rights of a person. And then on the right picture there, you can see that coming out of more of a left or liberal ideology, the role of the government should be to protect individual human rights, specifically in terms of civil rights. And then all of these things start to come to a head I would say, out of the chaos of the Vietnam period. So this is like late Vietnam, late 60s, throughout the 70s, there's this developing tension because economically speaking, the rest of the world had started to catch up to the United States. It took them 20, 30 years after World War II, but now there's finally international competition for businesses, and so the debate is, should we still be a globalist economy, or should we pull back and become more of a nationalist economy to protect ourselves now that we have competition on the big stage? And then the civil rights issues, as we've talked about, the protesting, the social chaos, and then a seminal event in 1973, Roe versus Wade, really started to have an influence on shifting political allegiances from a demographic perspective. That, as I said, that there was a fourth alignment. The question is there a fifth alignment, and if so, what is that fifth alignment? I'm going to presume that there is a fifth alignment, and kind of talk as if there is a fifth alignment, maybe even a sixth alignment. That this out of Roe versus Wade, as well as the economic hardships in the 70s, Ronald Reagan is elected president in 1980, and one of the big reasons he was elected is what was called the Democrats for Reagan. So that and this was made up of not just the union workers who were suffering economically and were rejecting the Democratic Party, but also you have more and more Catholic voters voting Republican. Catholic voters up until Roe versus Wade had been pretty consistently voting with the Democratic Party. Now, over the issue of Roe versus Wade, you have more Catholic voters voting Republican. And you know, just prior to Reagan, kind of like the precedent for Reagan was this thing that Nixon espoused, this idea of a silent majority, or the moral majority, that Americans in general, they might not be loud as some of their peers, but Americans in general are according to Nixon, tend to be more conservative, more rigid in their morality, and did not like what was going on with the social chaos, drugs, protests, sit-ins, and all that kind of stuff. And so Reagan, and to a degree Nixon, had tapped into that. On the flip side, what's going on in the Democratic Party is that, well, in a way, like Clinton was, two things are interesting about Clinton. He was the last gasp of the Democratic Party in the South. And so that's why I put in the picture there of he and Gore as Huck and Tom. So that's one issue, that the Democratic Party in the South has been going down since, let's just say roughly Reagan. The other issue is that Bill Clinton became a much more globalist and Wall Street style of Democrat. So that was a change as well. That one of the previous parts of the fourth alignment was that Republicans were business and Democrats were workers. And Bill Clinton tried to do both. He tried to be a Wall Street Democrat as well as a supporter of workers. He was trying to build a coalition, and then that's why I have that picture of Obama too. That Obama, they call it, the Obama coalition. That how many different social, demographic, economic groups he was able to put together. And then when we see the elections in 2016, that Hillary Clinton was that it turns out it was not a Democratic coalition, it was an Obama coalition. That Hillary Clinton couldn't keep that group of people together, and conversely, President Trump, similar to President Reagan, was able to tap into groups that had been historically perceived as Democratic groups, specifically the Rust Belt and union workers and such. So this is what I'm talking about a possible fifth alignment. Now, in all of this chart here is very old. You can probably find different ones on the internet that are more accurate, or not necessarily more accurate, but more up to date, because I noticed, for example, one of the things I had on here was the assault weapons ban, which as most people know, had a death date built into the law, so it was only actually the legal 1994 to 2004, and that was still on this worksheet, so it tells you when I made this. So generally speaking, these are the two-party platforms, though. But as I said in a couple of emails I sent out, I don't know any Democrat who believes everything on the left. I don't know any Republican who believes everything on the right. Specifically, if you go down and you look at free trade and protectionist, right, you can see how that's flip-flopped, where you had President Obama and candidate Clinton, until she changed her mind, being supportive of the TTP and free trade, and it was Donald Trump, through his victory in the election, was able to make the Republican Party more, or is trying to make the Republican Party more protectionist. I say that because we can just go back 20, 30 years ago, and you take an issue like NAFTA, right? NAFTA's negotiated by President H.W. Bush, a Republican, initially criticized by Democrats, and then as Bill Clinton becomes president, he then embraces it, to the degree that there's that famous debate between Al Gore and Ross Perot, where you have a Democrat defending free trade. So some of these issues flip. A lot of times, I mean, these are pretty good baselines. A lot of times when the parties flip, it's because of the personal interests of the leader of the party. In this case, President Trump being able to make his party slightly more protectionist. But I also pulled out Social Security, probably like the third rail of American politics. That's a big issue. And then back to what I said already about big government and small government. I guess my point that I feel is lost by the partisan news is that both political parties, their economic plans make sense. The Democrats believe in providing a lot of services. Therefore, you have to pay for them, and therefore you have a big government and higher taxes. Republicans don't believe in a lot of services and programs. Therefore, you don't need to have a big government, and therefore you don't need a lot of taxes. It's not like one is right or one is wrong. Because, take, for example, let's take the Republican model, and you cut taxes and you cut the size of government. Well, theoretically, then the individuals have more money to then pay for their own things, or to, through charity, help pay for other people's things. And so the problem that I see, and I've seen for about 20 or 30 years, is what we have done, because we have a separation of powers in this government, as opposed to a parliamentary government where you can just go through and make, whoever wins makes the rules. The problem is that we have created a hybrid approach where what the average American likes is they like the Republican idea of lower taxes, and what the average American likes is the Democratic idea of lots of services. Well, that's illogical, right? You can't have a lot of services without paying for it. And so what we have done is we've gone into debt and debt and debt and debt. At the beginning of the term, we talked about the political compass, and here's just another way you can look at it. Again, remember, this is an international political compass and not an American political compass, and that's why, for example, the U.S. Republican Party is pretty close to dead center, because there are so many more parties out to the right, internationally speaking. But, these are the opinions, and this is how you would plot it out on a chart. Problem is we're really not doing that anymore. Where we are now is we just disagree with each other for the sake of disagreeing, right? And in my opinion, not just my opinion, but I so wholeheartedly support this position, and that we've changed. Political parties are no longer intellectual endeavors or thought through choices. It's team loyalty. It's brand loyalty. If you take, for example, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, or specifically, let's leave Iraq alone. Let's go with the war in Afghanistan. Well, Bush did it, therefore, if I'm a Republican, it's okay, and I'm a Democrat, it must be wrong. Obama becomes president and continues the war in Afghanistan. Well, because Obama's doing it and I'm a Democrat, it's now it's right. All of a sudden, the war was wrong and now it's right. And then conversely, I'm a Republican, the war was right and now it's wrong because Obama's president. It's just absurd where we are. And I just pulled out two issues there, like NAFTA on the bottom left. Democrats and Republicans have both said it's a good thing. They've both said it's a bad thing, and it's usually done to undermine whoever is the president. And even worse of an issue is the debt and the deficit. That it seems like only the party out of power cares about the size of the national debt. It's become pretty hypocritical the way people say that they're pro spending limits and they want to fix the national debt, and then they go and they pass laws that cut taxes and increase spending. We should really demand a little bit more consistency from people across the political spectrum. So that's what I had for you today. I just wanted to introduce the concept of alignment and how the United States has always had a binary system, but we've had about 4 or 5 perhaps we're entering a sixth period of alignment of political parties, and what those issues are that define and are debated by political parties. Thank you very much, and I hope you learned something new. Thanks.